able to leave development without. And I wanted to talk about this because one of the things that I found is that when I'm developing my own Rails apps, I do all this work, I get my thing, my app working is really, really cool, and then I go to deploy to production, and oh shit, there's actually a lot more work I have to do now because there's things that you want your app to do in production that it doesn't and shouldn't do in development. So that's what I want to talk about, and specifically, there are some really nice gems to help you do these things. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce like two really awesome, well actually maybe like 3 or 4 really awesome gems you should be using in development because they're really, really nice. First up is quiet assets. If you've ever done Rails development locally, then you'll see a lot of this. Can you read that, by the way? Is the contrast okay for the really small writing? Is it? Yeah. Hard to read? It kind of sucks. Hang on. Woo. Let's see if we can do some of this. Is that better? Ugh. We kind of lose some definition, don't we, in the thing. Okay, well, sorry about that. You don't need to read that text anyway because it's the crap that you don't ever need to see in development. All your assets being loaded every single time you make a request. You don't get that in production because Rails doesn't serve your assets. It compiles them all into nice, long, single files, and then you let Nginx take care of that. Quiet assets just make them all shut the hell up. You don't see those lines anymore, and it actually makes it nice to read your logs because you don't get this crap every time. So just put it in your gem file under development and test, and never touch it again. It just works. Pretty cool. Another favorite of mine, better errors. Oh my goodness, better errors is amazing. Very simply, if you ever had an error in Rails, you probably have a lot because that's how you build Rails apps. You get an error and fix it. You get a lovely page with a stack trace on it and like your parameters that got passed, things like that. But it's not very helpful beyond that. Better errors gives you a page that looks like this. Down the left-hand, no, wait, is that your left? Yes. Down the left-hand side is a stack frames. So every single frame in your application shows up there. You can navigate between them. You can go all the way out through your controller into a rack, and you can see what's going on. And on the right is, you can see at the top there the few lines of code that it broke on. And underneath, there's a REPL, like IRB, in your browser that you can see what the hell's going on. If you ever had no method square brackets for nil, for example, is a good one. If you try to dereference a hash that doesn't exist, but you have 3 or 4 different hashes you're looking at in the same line, you know which one it is. This is really good because you can try and dereference them all in turn and see which one is broken. And you can step through everything like that. It's very, very useful. Again, you just sort of drop it in, just works. Only in development, don't do it in production, otherwise weird things happen. And binding of caller is the gem that gives you access to the REPL. If you don't have binding of caller, it just shows this information, which is still very useful, but you can't type in that little box. Other cool tools, Pry and Pry Debugger. Pry is an alternative to IRB. You can just use it on the command line to do some cool stuff with Ruby in an interactive fashion. Pry Debugger adds your common debug commands to Pry. So next, step, continue, finish to walk through your code as you're doing it. You set breakpoints as well. And it's really simple to do. You just go into your source, you write binding.pry, and whenever it hits that line, it'll drop out into your terminal, and you can do things in mid-request, basically. Which is sort of basically, it's the controlled version of this, as in, you meant it to happen, rather than, oh, something's broken, let's fix it. It allows you to get an inspection code out of running, which is really fun. Okay, let's talk about production. That's enough about development. We're going to talk about production. Why is your mouse in the middle of my screen? Go away. Wait, go away. There we go. That's better. Let's talk about production. So, development environments are usually very, very simple. There are some sort of common facts that all development environments share. Number one, they're all single user. That's you. You use the environment, no one else does, because it runs usually on your local machine, or maybe in the VM on your local machine. In some cases, if you're developing something particularly large, you'll run it on a dedicated box on your desk, maybe. But the only person using it is you. So that means everything is very controlled, you don't have to worry too much about it. And you also get immediate feedback, because usually you'll have your console open and wherever on the screen, I have it in my bottom corner. So you can see log files spewing past, and as an error occurs, you just go, oh look, here's the stack trace, or you have better errors running, and you just see it in your browser, and you can go, oh crap, an error has occurred, let's go fix it. It's also a secure environment, especially if you're running localhost, it never leaves the box you're running on, so you don't have to worry about anyone intercepting your data or running crazy attacks on your app because it's not accessible from outside. Most of the time, if you're calling APIs, obviously there's some amount of external stuff going on, but we're going to assume that in the general case you're just talking to your local machine and not going around talking to lots of different boxes when you're in development. So with those things in mind, we're going to sort of go through each one in turn and ask ourselves, how do we make this work in production? Okay, number one, environment management. So Xander gave a really good like talk last month before about Figaro.
Figaro was
last month. Figaro is a tool for doing exactly this. Now, your environment in Rails and in software development in general is all those things that are specific to your application that you need to load within your app to run. Things like API keys, for example, like your Rails secret key for seeding your cookies, stuff like that. SSL certificates, if you have an SSL certificate, you should. I'm going to talk about that later. All these things that you have to set up for your application, but that you don't want to have the same between production and development. This is what you find when you try and deploy your app to production for the first time. You go, oh, hang on. Those strike keys that I put in, they're the test strike keys. I need the production strike keys for this one. Or I don't want to pollute my API usage with all my development test calls and my production stuff. I want to keep that physically separate. So keeping control of your environment and making sure that you have separate environments for every instance of your application is really important. So how do you do that? Well, Figaro is a really good gem for doing this. As Anna mentioned the other week, Figaro allows you to create a file. Figaro is a Rails-specific configuration management, environment management gem, and it creates a file called config/application.yaml, and in there you can put all the different things that your application needs. So this is an example from the GitHub page. They're using Pusher to do push notifications. So they have their Pusher app ID, their Pusher key, and their Pusher secret. Critically, this file is not checked into version control. As soon as you check stuff like this, sensitive information into version control, you should go and replace those keys. They're now considered compromised. You shouldn't use them anymore. Even if it's only a private repository that's used by members of your team, you have no way of knowing where that code is going to end up eventually. Even if you go through and scrub your version control history, there's still the chance that someone has an old version of the branch checked out somewhere and your keys are in there, and then they sell a laptop and someone else gets a hold of it and all of a sudden they have your keys, or something stupid like that. The easiest thing to do is just revoke keys that you accidentally put into version control or accidentally get publicized, and then replace them in here. The really nice thing about Figaro, the reason I use it over other alternatives, is that you can specify different environments right in this YAML file, and it picks up the Rails environment that you're running in and loads the particular keys, or rather, it always loads the keys that are in the general set, but it'll overwrite them with the keys from the specific set if you have them. You can also nullify keys by like putting in a double dash, I think this will happen. So by doing this, you can have all your configuration, all your environment variables in one place, and then you can push them around to wherever your environments are separately from your application. So you can maybe rsync this to your production server, or if you're using Heroku, you can use the config tool to put those straight up into the environment. And the important thing about these values is that these are environment variables. As if you could define them, everyone's maybe familiar with things like path as the environment variable. Editor is another useful one for doing equal editing of the terminal. Excuse me. Figaro loads these values as environment variables, which means that when your code references them, they're just talking to them as if they're environment variables. So if you're in an environment that doesn't use Figaro, your code should still work, because you can load them up as environment variables, and it just goes. Figaro has a really nice functionality on top of that, which is that it wraps the environment, the raw environment stuff, Usually in Rails, you'll call like env brackets name of my key to get to the environment. Figaro wraps that in a module, so you can call figaro.env.key, and it gives you back the value. And on the surface, this seems very similar. Like I just want the key back. Why should I bother writing this instead of the shorter env key? But what this allows you to do quite nicely is you can, in tests, for example, you can fake this out by using some kind of mocking tool. You can just say, oh, my Figaro environment key for this is 1 or something, and don't have to worry about looking at that environment hash. So if you're using Rails, I would highly recommend putting Figaro into your application. It allows you to be very flexible with how you manage your environment variables. If you're not using Rails, .env is a good alternative. It provides similar functionality, but instead of using an application YAML, it uses a file called .env. So if you're familiar with .files, there's a whole lot of them in your home directory, and they're used for configuring things like Git and Vim and Emacs and all your favorite tools. So it's a relatively well-known standard for providing configuration. And you write them in this format, the very standard key equals value format. Just as if you're putting in a shell script, you might be doing, export, push your app ID, export, push your key, and you reference them using env, just like you would if they were defined somewhere else. It lacks a lot of the features that Figaro does. This is a flat file, and actually, it's strange. The .env documentation recommends checking the .env file into source control with your development keys in. I wouldn't do that for the previously stated reasons. So what you have to do is there's no space for your namespaces for different environments. You have to make a copy of this file on your production server, or on your staging server, or on all the different nodes in your cluster, and fill it with your production values. So that's the sort of big difference, is how it manages those values. There's no fancy wrapper around the environment here. You just reference it directly. But I would still recommend using it because in an environment, in a multi-threaded environment, particularly application servers, which we're going to get into a bit later, like Unicorn, if you're doing 0 downtime deploys, the way Unicorn does it is it forks its processes so that you always have a continuous chain of processes. It doesn't reload the environment from your machine because it just takes the context from the parent. So if you change your environment variables in the actual, maybe your bash script, or you have a command that you run to start things, they won't get reloaded when you restart Unicorn in that fashion. So that bit me in the butt a couple of times. So something like .env, whenever your application starts, it loads these things up and off you go, which is rather nice. Next big thing, let's put that somewhere where I just destroy my laptop. The next big thing in production that you should really care about is error reporting. As I said before, when you're in development, you've got this, nice little terminal spins around, shows you the stack traces. You've got the page in your application that just shows you the stack trace, shows you what's happened, and you can get immediate feedback and fix it straight away. In production, you're not in front of your computer. Someone else is in front of their computer, and they're talking to your server, which you're also not in front of, and they're going to get a cryptic error on their screen that says, oops, something went wrong. And you're never going to find out. If you just do a default Rails deploy, you're never going to know that happened, unless your nice user happens to email you about it and say, your app is broken, please fix it. Which is like basically literally the text of the little support ticket that I've received. So we need a method for notifying, aggregating, displaying errors that you as a developer can come and find out about it. The simplest way to do this that I found is a gem called exception notification. And it is a piece of middleware, which I'm going to get deeper into what middleware is a little bit down the line in case you're not familiar. But it's a piece of middleware that you run underneath your application. Excuse me. That will, in case of an exception in your application, it very simply packages up the details, sends you an email. Cool. Now every time an error occurs, you get an email about it. You have a stack trace handy. You can look it up in your source code. You can maybe look at it. As long as your application can send email, you can use this. There's no external service required. does the email stuff inline in your main thread, which usually doing email in the main thread is bad because your user is waiting for that to happen, but it's already broken. The user isn't going to get any useful information back anyway, so you might as well spend that time packaging it up and sending it back to you, the developer. And maybe you can add a message to the front end saying, the developer has been notified about this error. Please sit tight while he fixes it over the next 4 to 8 weeks. Exception notification also has integrations with several popular chat software like if you use Campfire or Slack or Flowdoc or any of these team chats, you can post automatically to these platforms. You can also just send a simple web HTTP request to a location you provide in order to handle it using something else. Maybe you have some custom system that will, knows how to respond to those requests, or at least receive those requests and log them. So I would, if nothing else, I would recommend putting this in your app before you put them in production, so that you can just know when errors are happening. Maybe it's only once in a blue moon that an error occurs because your code is perfect and nothing ever goes wrong. But it's dead useful. You just know there's a problem. You don't get any nice tools with it to help you resolve it, or know about the frequency or where the user is coming from or what they were doing at the time. But it's just a flag that you can set to say, hey, go fix this. If you want something heavyweight and you maybe have some money to throw around, get yourself an exception notification service. There are tons of them. I've listed the most popular ones here. I got this list from the Ruby Toolbox, which is an excellent website, rubytoolbox.com. There's a category full of exception notification gems. These are the most popular ones. Airbrake, very famous notification, exception notification service. Urbit, which is an open source clone of Airbrake that uses the same API. So you actually use the Airbrake gem in your code, and you just point it at an Urbit server that you've deployed somewhere, maybe on a free Heroku instance, to handle those things. Honeybadger is a relatively new service that I've not used before, but is apparently very popular. Rollbar takes a slightly different approach. It actually monitors your log files for errors and sends them to you that way. So there's no code in your application being executed. It happens in a separate thread, so you're not interrupting anything your application is doing. I use Rollbar on a project of mine, and pretty cool. I like it. Aside from having a nice web page to visit, these things will do things like you can give it your repository URL for GitHub, for example, and it will look at the stack trace and link you to the line in your repository that the error occurred. So you can straight away from the web page go, oh, click it. Oh, it's in this method, in this controller. I have the whole thing in front of me. Now I can open my editor and find out what's going on. It'll aggregate them, so it'll give you stats on how many times the error has occurred, what times of day, whether there was a bunch at one time, so you can correlate against external events maybe to see if there's a relationship there. Things like open issues on Jira, GitHub, or whatever you use, so that you can put that straight back into your development flow with little effort involved. The downside, obviously, is that these things are usually paid services or require more maintenance than a simple email. Like I said, Airbrake, Honeybadger, Rollbar are all paid services above a certain threshold. Airbrake is free, it's open source, but obviously you have another application to maintain and apply all of these rules to that as well. Urbit's funny because if an error occurs in Urbit, it notifies itself that it's broken. So there's a special section saying Urbit errors, which I always sort of make me boggle a little bit, because what if that fails? Does it notify itself again, and you end up, how many layers deep do you go before it decides to stop? I believe Shopify uses Urbit internally for tracking errors, so it's not something that's only good for hobby projects. You can catch errors from extremely large applications using Urbit. What's next? Application servers. Yes, application servers are fun. Application servers are, or an application server is the piece of code that runs your Rails app. Rails itself, when you run Rails, it doesn't immediately know how to handle HTTP stuff. It runs underneath a couple of things. It runs rack, and then rack runs on top of an application server that handles the raw HTTP stuff that goes on underneath. You'll often want to also use another HTTP server outside of that. It's often called a reverse proxy or a routing server. Nginx and Apache are two common extremely common methods of doing that. But your actual Rails app itself works on top of an application server. In development, that application server by default is Webrick or Webrick, I don't know how you pronounce it. It's part of the Ruby standard library. Pretty straightforward, it serves requests, but that's really all it's good at. I wouldn't recommend using it in production. I would replace it with something that is better suited to the particular application that you're looking at. There are a couple of good options. I'm going to go through a few of them here. Like I said, Webrick is the default. Don't use that in production. It's not very good. Thin is an evented web server that's written on top of a library called something that I forget, which basically means it runs on a single thread but has a scheduler so that you can have multiple tasks going on at once, and the application won't know, basically. The fact that it's only running on a single thread, it'll think it's multi-threaded even though it's not. It's useful if you don't want to start doing concurrency and stuff like that. Personally, I use Thin in development because it's just a nice little web server. It's also very lightweight. The configuration isn't very big. Makes it easy to run. You drop the gem to a gem file. Rails picks it up by default, and now you're running on Thin without any extra configuration. Getting a bit more complicated. Unicorn. Unicorn is a multi-threaded application server that runs effectively multiple parallel instances of your app side by side and routes requests to. Doesn't route requests. You use Nginx or Apache to route requests to different instances of your app as necessary. It allows so much higher concurrency, like Webrick. If someone's using your app while they're using Webrick, that's it. One person gets to use it at a time. Everyone else has to wait, which is fine for extremely simple applications, but as soon as you get a large user base or lots of processing going on, you're going to want more than one person to be able to use your app at once. That's why something like Unicorn is good. Unicorn works particularly well, I find, on Heroku, because even though you have one dyno on Heroku, which is one piece of machine that runs your code, you can still having multiple instances of Unicorn running inside it. So you still get some concurrency for free out of that. Passenger, or Fusion Passenger, is designed to be sort of an all-in-one solution. If you don't care about how this stuff works, Fusion Passenger, and even if you do, but if you don't care about how any of this stuff works, Fusion Passenger is a good choice because it just handles absolutely everything. Your reverse proxy, your application server, even some aspects of deployment, it just goes. You don't have to know too much about it. It's like being in first class, being like a first class passenger on an airjet. That's why it's called Passenger. And finally, Puma is, let me get this right. It's an evented web server, like Thin, but it's very, very fast. It's thing called Puma because Pumas run fast. So if you have a lot of things like WebSockets running or server-sent events running, lots of long-running connections that are periodically going to have to do things, Puma's really good because it just does those really fast and lets you get back to serving other requests. My personal opinion is that you should go with Unicorn as the default unless your application is particularly well suited for one of the other options. Unicorn has a small amount of configuration involved in getting it up and running. You can do things like define the number of workers that it runs, what sockets it's available on, stuff like that. But it's all relatively boilerplate. So getting it up and running is pretty straightforward. Which I have my notes because I know what's coming next. Thanks. Anything else? Oh, yeah. So those are the three big topics that I wanted to raise today. Application servers, environment management, and the other one, error reporting. That's the most important one, so I should probably not forget it. Because they're all topics that you don't really think about when you're doing development. They're all either not present because you're in a single user environment, so you don't need concurrency to provide with something like Unicorn. You don't need error reporting because your error reporting is built in and it just shows up. And you don't need, my God, I'm forgetting everything today. And you don't need environment management because you only have the one environment, so you just mess with it until it works. You don't have to care about duplicating it or keeping it safe, any of that kind of thing. However, there are some other really nice things that you may want to do with your application that middleware is good for. Rails, Sinatra, all these common Ruby web servers all run on top of a framework called Rack. And it's not even a framework, it's more of a protocol that bridges the gap between raw HTTP and something manageable for web applications to use. It's an abstraction between raw HTTP stuff and Ruby objects. So middleware is something that you can run on top of Rack that sits between the Rack level and your application and does things to every request. It's sort of about as broad as you can get in terms of scope, because it happens outside your application. It hasn't hit a root, so you don't have a controller, you don't have a view yet, you don't have any models when you get to this stage on the way in. So you can, it's very expansive in terms of like what you can do, and it happens to every single request that comes into your app. It's useful when you want to get things done quickly, because you don't have to get into your Rails environment. And it's useful when you want to do something absolutely everywhere. A lot of the time, you know, functionality happens before you hit controller methods, or you put a before filter in. Maybe a really important before filter happens in your application controller because it happens to every single request that comes into the controller. Middleware happens before all that. You know, you can get access to the request before all that if you use middleware. So it's useful for some really cool things. Rack canonical host is one of my favorites. If you've ever used Heroku, you'll know that you get a long-winded Heroku URL that you use, like fancy Pacific Garden 279.herokuapp.com. Or you can specify your own name, but either way, it's like myapplication.herokuapp.com. Cool. You happen to get a secure version of that endpoint for free, HTTPS myapplication.herokuapp.com. But there's nothing forcing users to use that. Anyone wanting to write anything relatively serious on Heroku is going to get a custom domain set up too. So now all of a sudden you've got myawesomeapp.com, which will access your app. You've got myapp.heroku.com, which accesses your app. And if you know what you're doing, you've also got secure versions of both of those URLs. So that's already 4 different URLs that your app can be accessed on that may cause problems if you're doing certain things. One sort of common task in Rails is, well, semi-common task is figuring out what URL I'm currently on, or what host I'm currently running on. If you want to do things like set up webhooks or a lot of the kind of logging, you need to know, like, not just what path am I in, but what host am I running on. A common way of doing that is you just say request.host. What host was requested by the user. But if you have all these URLs that are available on all the different hosts, you're going to get different answers back different times. And if you're doing things, especially with APIs, that require you to have a single host that you tell them about, the safe host. So if people are coming referring from different URLs, different hosts, your API provider is going to get pissy and throw out like, it's bad news. Which brings me around to say that Rack canonical host allows you to sort of ignore all that, because you set it up in your config group, or also you can do an application RB if you're in Rails. The syntax is slightly different. The next one has an example from there. But you get your environment, which happens anyway, and then you just say, hey, I want to use canonical host. Fetch my host from the environment, because you're all using environment management now, so you're using environment variables for all this stuff. You're never putting any plain strings in here, because that would be bad. And my favorite option is force SSL true. And if someone comes into your application on a host that isn't this, that doesn't match this, you can use regexes for this, which is quite nice. So if you have certain subdomains that are allowed, but certain subdomains that shouldn't exist, you can root off of those. Or if they're not using SSL, or a whole host of other different options, it'll respond with a 302 permanently moved and put them back to whatever host it's supposed to be on. They'll keep the path, so they'll still get where they expect to go, but they'll have the right host. And this all happens transparently. The user doesn't see anything on the front end. They'll just, oh, that's a different URL on the bar. That's a secure version of my preferred host, and off we go. So that's really, really nice, just to keep the experience consistent for your users, without doing weird things like saying, like just refusing connections on certain hosts. So they're technically valid. So that is that one. Replicas domains on Heroku, yes. Rack Attack, which has a great name. Single user websites on developments don't ever get attacked by people because no one can ever reach them. But once you get out to the wilds of the internet, people are going to try and do silly things like DDoS your application or try and do all kinds of weird shit to it. So Rack Attack is kind of like a first line defense against that kind of thing. You can get it to you can set it with whitelists, blacklists, throttling. So if someone has tried in the past to do nasty things to your site, you can just block their IP. If someone is requesting your site too often, you can throttle them. Or if there are domains that you know are safe, maybe you have a service that provides you with webhooks. So even if I send you webhooks every half a second, I still want to respond to those because those are legit requests. You put them in the whitelist. Tools such as fail2ban, Google Lists for generating these lists. Rack just provides the mechanism by which they are applied. And the reason why this is really, really good to have as middleware, specifically, is because, as I said before, it's really, really fast. If you're experiencing some kind of malicious attack, especially distributed denial of service attacks, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time loading a Rails environment, all the random stuff that happens in there. You just want to ditch that request as fast as possible. So, to a first approximation, use Rack Attack. If you're doing something serious, there's much more you can do to mitigate this kind of stuff at an even further, or an even lower level. But if nothing else, put this in. It's kind of cool. Oh, Rack Google Analytics. It's always nice to know who your website is doing, and Google Analytics is just a really straightforward method of doing so. So there's this lovely. Why is my mouse back over here? Yeah. That's not my mouse. That's my mouse. Mouse is. What mouse pointer is that? Oh god, what have I done? What mouse pointer is that? It's not that one. It's not that one. There's a ghost in my machine. Putting Google Analytics in your middleware just means that it's going to be uploaded into every single page that you respond to, no matter what controller, if it's an asset that you happen to have, dynamic asset maybe. It just puts that tracking code in there for you. So you don't have to worry about putting it in your application controller or muddying the code with it, or putting it in the view maybe, especially if you have multiple layouts, because you have to have that code in every single layout in your application or the run. If you don't like Google Analytics for whatever reason, I'm sure there are other middlewares for other analytics platforms. And if there isn't, you can probably use this as the basis to add on because it just injects JavaScript into the page. All those three very, very good. Talk a little bit about Heroku. And the reason I want to do that is because it's a popular platform. It's great for people who haven't deployed apps into production very much because it takes away a lot of the pain involved in doing so. It has its own environment management, has its own deploy pipeline, it has its own roofing, has its own DDoS mitigation stuff, but it does have some quirks. It's not the simplest. Yeah, maybe it's quite simple, but it has some quirks to it in the way that Rails has to operate while it's running. In the way that Rails operates while it's running on Heroku. So specifically, there's this gem. If you ever deployed to Heroku before and you haven't had this gem, you get a nice warning in the deploy output that says, "Hey, we're injecting a gem called Rails 12 factor." You go, "What's that? Why does it have to be there?" 12 factor is this sort of scheme, or it's almost like a manifesto for web apps that I believe was created by Heroku or a chap at Heroku that lays out these 12 points that good citizens of web application land should do. Rails does 10 of them really, really well, but it doesn't do 2 of them. So 12 factor forces Rails to serve assets for you. Usually this will be handled by a reverse proxy, like Nginx or Apache. You point it at the public assets folder of your Rails app, and that will serve it straight through, so it doesn't even load your Rails code. 12 factor gets Rails to serve it itself because Heroku doesn't put any reverse proxy between you and the world. It has a because of the way that the routing works. It also redirects your logs to standard out rather than putting them in files, because that's another tenant of 12-factor apparently. I guess it's so that you can know consistently where your logs are going, no matter if you're running Rails or Sinatra or some homebrew web application. As long as your logs are coming out and standard out, tools that you use can, hook into that and read that pipe and see what's going on. So this is what 12-factor does. It also removes the warning when you deploy it that you should have it, so that's a good reason to put it in. Also, if you're deploying to Heroku, put a Ruby definition in your gem file, because otherwise, again, Heroku complains about it and just uses the default. So it's twofold. It gets rid of a warning, and it prevents weird things where Heroku's default is different than the one that you think you should be using. So maybe if you're using 2.1, for example, and it defaults to 2, you're going to miss some stuff. Some particular optimization you're relying on doesn't exist, or some API that you're using doesn't exist. So make sure you put that in there when you're using Heroku. So yeah, those are my recommendations for things that you should do to your app, things that you should add to your app, things that you should be thinking about when you deploy your app into production for the first time. I've deployed a number of apps to production, my own personal projects as well as projects for employers. And usually I'll do the first deploy is like, yes, I can access my app. And then I go, oh crap, I don't have any of these nice things that I should really do. And I think it's breaking, but I don't know for sure. And I'll go back and add this stuff. So that's why I wanted to do this talk, to sort of give you guys a little bit of insight into the kind of things you should be thinking about, particularly if you're relatively new to the process of deploying your own apps. Maybe if you've had experience in the past using, working at companies that have fancy things like operations teams that will do, will handle all this stuff for you. Just to give you guys an idea of what to be thinking about. And with that, I want to open it up to you guys, because I'm sure that this is like a very thin sliver of what's available out there in terms of libraries that are useful for production applications written in Ruby. So, does anybody have? Hello? Ooh, it's working. Where's Mike? Mike, can you come and grab the mic, Mike? And if anyone has anything they want to mention, please put your hand up, and Mike will come and bring you the mic, point your mic, and you can tell me about them, and then we can discuss it. I hope someone does, because otherwise it's going to be really boring. Anyone have any fun gems? Oh, one front end. Yeah. Or any gems in general that you like using for things. I'm thinking about things specifically that aren't like an integral part of your application. Like everyone uses devise, everyone uses some kind of authorization, like Pundit or CanCan. So I'm wondering about things that you use that aren't part of your main application that are really helpful to you. Yes, please. Go.
Sorry, I just had a quick question about the last thing you mentioned, Rails 12-factor.
Yep.
You said one of the things it does redirects logs to standard out.
Yep.
Why would you want to do that?
So, because Heroku reads logs from standard out, is like the easy answer. 12-factor, like I said, it's sort of this manifesto about. 12-factor is sort of this manifesto about things that good web apps should do to make it easier to write integrations, write tools to run in various environments. So the thought behind the log files thing. Sorry, can you turn your mic off, or because I think it's feedbacking through. Okay, so the log files thing is everyone stores log files in different places. Rails has a specific spot it puts log files in. Sinatra has a specific spot it puts log files in. And 12-factor is specific to any particular framework or language. So I don't know, Django probably puts log files somewhere different than PHP or whatever your favorite Go web framework is. They'll put log files whatever the hell they like, and you just have to know to go and get them from there. By writing your logs to standard out, if an app bills itself as being 12-factor, any tool that you write to do log analysis or some of this error reporting stuff, all it has to do is know that logs are being piped standard out, which is like the common denominator amongst processes in Unix type environments. They all have standard out, they all have standard error. Even if you don't have a file system, that's the other thing. Heroku's file system is extremely ephemeral. You can't rely on anything being there that you wrote last request. So it just abstracts the storage of logs and puts them in a place that you know exists. So if you're writing a third-party tool to deal with that stuff, you just hook on standard out, and you know you're going to get logs, regardless of what framework, what language, what platform it's being deployed on, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of the deal behind TalkBack in general. It's the standardization of all these key things in order to make integration easier. I guess is my interpretation of that. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Sander has a question. Or a gem that he likes to use, maybe.
Actually, it's going to be a question. I do a lot of, when I deploy an app, I usually use Heroku. I was blindsided the other day about Capistrano, like the question about Capistrano. And I just I know it's part of the Rails bundle, but I'm not entirely sure where and I know it has something to do with deploying, but I don't really know where it falls into the deploying process.
Sure. Yeah, so Heroku uses Git for deployment in a very direct fashion. There is a repository that Git gives you access to, and it hooks into the events on that repository. So that when there is a push to a particular branch, master in the general case, it knows that it should deploy the application. So it starts that chain of events that eventually results in an application running on their hardware. So you've got asset compilation, you've got bundling, all these kinds of things. Capistrano is a tool for doing something similar in a much more general environment. So say you have a server somewhere, VPS on Amazon or DigitalOcean or something like that, that you have SSH access to, and you want to put your app on it. Capistrano is a tool that you run locally that will tell, it runs a series of commands over SSH on the remote machine to do any number of things, basically. Common tasks such as fetch my app from a given repository. So you give it, your GitHub repository, or your Bitbucket repository, or your wherever you have to store your stuff, and it has access via the deploy key or something. So the first thing it will do is it will go and fetch your repository. And then it has to bundle that, so Capistrano opens up an SSH connection to the remote machine again and says, bundle my thing. And then it comes back, and no success, backpull. So it provides a, instead of every time you want to deploy having to manually SSH into your machine and manually type out audio commands, it creates a pipeline that you can hook into with various gems. So ultimately, when you end up doing a Capistrano deploy, at the very simple level, you just have a cat file, a Capistrano configuration file. You just load a series of gems into it, and they will automatically do the tasks required to deploy their responsibilities. So there's a Rails one. There is a Redis, for example. Unicorn has a Capistrano plugin, and they all have their specific sets of commands that they load, and then just run them on the remote server, and ultimately you will end up with a running application in the same way that Heroku does, but the mechanism by which it does it is different. You're actually using your remote machine, your local machine has all those commands, and you're opening up an SSH connection, run the command, close the SSH connection, open a new SSH connection, run the command, close this. I think they're separate. There are tools that do it in one go, so they'll just open an SSH connection, and then close it at the end. But that's sort of the basics of how Capistrano works. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and just to clarify what you said, is Capistrano then a separate tool that you have to set up outside of your Rails app, or is it actually, and the gem is just for compatibility with that tool, or is it actually built into Rails so I can run like a Capistrano command?
So Capistrano, yes, Capistrano is a tool outside of Rails. In the same way as like Rake is a tool outside of Rails. Yeah. It's a command line tool that you use to perform certain actions, whereas Rake usually performs local commands, like creating the database migrations, that kind of thing. Yeah. Capistrano allows you to perform those commands on remote machines. Okay. At very basic, the most basic level, that's what it does. Yeah. And then you can build these various pieces into one build pipeline that takes, starts from scratch, ends up with a running application at the end. Any other questions or personal favorite gens? No one seems to have any, which is sad. I'm sad. Do you have a question, or you just waving your hand?
Well, I was waving my hand, but I have a favorite, I guess.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Take the ball rolling with me. New Relic.
Oh, yeah, New Relic's a good one. So, along with error reporting and error, error tracking, performance tracking is often very important, especially if you start having large numbers of users coming into your application. And New Relic provides a lot of that. You can track response times for your application. You can track where the time was spent, whether it's in the database, whether it's in your Ruby code, whether it's in the internet connection between you and the client. It works particularly well with Heroku if you have it. There's an automatic integration that allows you to do things like inspect the number of workers that Unicorn is running and see what the load on each individual one is, which is quite nice. Other kinds of plugins. Anything particular you like using it for?
Most of the performance. It also handles the error reporting.
Yes, it does. It does both of those things. It also does cool stuff like long-running SQL queries, for example. If you have badly optimized SQL queries, it'll tell you about them. There are other tools to do that, but it provides them a nice web interface. New Relic is really, really good. It gets expensive very quickly if you want to run it on more than one Heroku on it, for example, but it's a very, very good tool. I'm not familiar. Tell me about Copilot. Grab my phone.
Okay.
It actually analyzes your code. This is it's a service where you can send it to your GitHub repository, and it will evaluate the quality of your code and look for security vulnerabilities and give your code an overall rating before you deploy.
So is it specific to security, or does it do style?
It's style security.
That's pretty cool. That's good. Now you mentioned, I see a lot of people like badges on GitHub repositories saying, here's my code climate score.
Yeah,
quite useful. Yeah,
that's
pretty cool.
It gives you a score based on their set criterion.
Yeah, that's a really good one. You don't want to start deploying things that have horrible security holes, whatever.
Yeah.
If you're after doing static security checks, Breakman is a really good tool as well. It keeps track of all the vulnerabilities that are exposed in, I think it's Rails specific. I don't know. Someone may be able to correct me on that. But sorry, Breakman, like Breakman on a train. It has a big lever and he stops the train. It gets a feed of all the vulnerabilities that are found in Rails and looks at your code to see if you're vulnerable to them. So, if, for example, an old good example is if you have what's an old good example? Something like if you have a root that says match string root or something, you should really use either get or post if you're only using one of those, because there's ways of putting nasty things into your app using that. It would go in there and say, oh, you have a matching root, root. Please change that. Please else with it. And that's quite a good thing to run again before you go into production, so that you can squash common security errors before you expose your things to the world. Thank you. Anybody else? Any more? Doesn't look like it. Thank you very much. I'm going to be around for the rest of the evening if anyone wants to chat to me about anything that I've said. These slides are online, but I'll get Mike to link to them from the meetup group because they're on SlideShare and the URL is massive. So thank you very much for listening to me fiddle on for however long I've been talking now. And enjoy the talk tonight. Thank you.